Okay, so this material, it's this really powerful philosophical contrast, right, between materialist and meaning-driven worldviews. It argues that self-knowledge is the foundation for resisting domination. We're going to dive right in.
It's a remarkable piece of work. I mean, the core challenge it presents, that you need internal clarity to fight external manipulation, is just so well articulated. But to really maximize its impact, we need to look at the foundations first.
Right. A huge theme here is that split between an indifferent existence and an aware one. So our first point is really about that essential philosophical jump.
The crucial transition from describing an indifferent universe to asserting an aware existence requires more philosophical scaffolding than a simple radical assumption.
It does a great job showing how materialism it collapses into absurdity. You know, that whole idea that if the train isn't going anywhere, your seat doesn't matter.
That part is philosophically watertight. But then, to counter that, the material introduces the religious worldview, and it relies on this, quote, single radical assumption: existence is aware.
And that's the jump?
Exactly. It's presented as a thematic opposite, but it isn't really defended logically. So if you've just convinced a skeptical reader that materialism leads to, silence, just announcing a conscious universe as the fix feels a bit like a hope, not a logical next step.
I see his challenge. For someone deep in a secular worldview, they need to feel guided there. They need to see the materialist framework breaking down on its own terms before a new one is introduced.
Precisely. The suggestion is to weave in some non-theological lines of reasoning a bit earlier, things that complicate the purely materialist picture from the inside. That way, the idea of a non-blind universe feels like an intellectual response, not just a leap of faith.
So you're basically making materialism implode by highlighting its inability to explain its own observer. That's a great move. How would we do that, though? Concretely.
Well, the material already has that great line, conscious islands floating in an unconscious sea. That's the contradiction right there. So before you even get to the religious worldview, maybe add a paragraph that just asks, if the world is truly unaware, how does human consciousness, which can think abstractly and invent ethics, arise from purely unconscious parts?
Ah, that stops the reader cold. It makes the shift feel inevitable, not just asserted.
Right. And you could build on that other line, behind order stands meaning. Maybe elaborate on why order itself seems to demand some kind of awareness. You don't have to prove a deity, just show that pure randomness doesn't quite explain the complexity we see.
Or even simpler, challenge the word accident from the start.
Yes, if all of this is just an accident, a fluke, why did we evolve the capacity to analyze and judge that accident? If the universe doesn't care, why did it produce beings who care so deeply?
That's powerful. These sorts of questions, they really pave the way. They make the author's conscious framework feel like the only logical way out of a contradiction the reader has already accepted.
And that's how you keep that expert audience on board. You're respecting their skepticism while leading them through the argument's core structure.
Okay, so if we agree the philosophical foundation needs that scaffolding, let's talk about the structure on top of it, the way the arguments are delivered. I mean, the piece is written with incredible force, which is a huge strength.
Oh, absolutely. The tone is powerful, almost prophetic. But while that's rhetorically strong, the reliance on these sweeping generalizations and absolute binaries, it can sometimes sacrifice a little nuance, which might weaken it for that expert audience it's targeting.
I think I see that in the sections on behavior. It sets up these very deterministic chains, like if the world is random, then life becomes consumption. Or it dismisses secular ethics too quickly, just saying the logic collapses under scrutiny.
That's it, exactly. And that's a risk because it overlooks really strong, noble movements like secular humanism or some forms of existentialism that do manage to separate an indifferent universe from ethical nihilism.
Right. I mean, people do try to build systems of meaning and duty without a transcendent source.
Wait, but isn't acknowledging that just diluting the force of the argument? Doesn't it slow things down if the piece is meant to be sharp and authoritative?
You'd think so, but it's actually the opposite. By dismissing the strongest alternatives too quickly, it almost makes the opposition seem weak, which in turn makes the author's own victory feel a little unearned.
Ah, I see.
So the goal isn't to soften the critique?
No, not at all. It's to show that you've anticipated the strongest possible defense and still found a fundamental flaw in it. It makes your final point that much more resilient.
So the suggestion is to add brief caveats, acknowledge the strong counterarguments.
Precisely. You make the opponent's position sound strong, noble, even worthy of respect. And then you show why it's still not enough.
So how could the author do that without, bloating the text? It needs to stay lean.
Well, when critiquing materialism, you could specifically credit the noble attempt of those who shift responsibility onto humanity. Acknowledge that saying there is no duty toward existence, only toward society, is a huge ethical lift.
Okay.
Then frame the question constructively. Something like, that makes sense, but could temporary agreements among fragile beings really be a sufficient ground for ethics? And then you pivot to show why those agreements are always vulnerable without a transcendent anchor.
I see a similar opportunity in the unity and division section. The analysis of the two forms of religion, one serving power, one serving justice, it's very sophisticated.
Yes, but it's framed as such a clean, absolute split, a binary.
We could challenge that. Suggest that maybe it's better framed as a spectrum, where that purity is constantly being contested. It's not just two separate camps, but a continuous internal struggle within all structures.
That adds so much depth. And it aligns perfectly with the need for constant self-knowledge that comes later on. It shows the corruption isn't just some external force, it's an internal temptation.
Exactly. Nuance doesn't weaken conviction. It sharpens it.
And that leads us perfectly into the payoff sections. The critique of modern life, self-knowledge, exploitation. The analysis of new forms of exploitation, psychological domination, is phenomenal.
It really is. That description of being chained to expectation, working to maintain appearances, it just captures modern life perfectly. The diagnosis is absolutely world-class.
But here's the gap, I think. To maximize the practical impact of those final sections, the material has to give the reader clear diagnostic tools to see how they are participating in these new forms of exploitation.
Yes, that's the weakness. The call to action is a bit too general. Phrases like, begin by questioning what feels natural, or examine what benefits you. They're true, but they don't give you a specific handle to grab onto.
The problem is defined with the precision of a laser, but the solution feels a bit like a fog machine.
That's a perfect way to put it. The author should translate that abstract critique into concrete, self-diagnostic questions. Questions that hit home for someone living in modern society. This is where the piece can really fulfill its promise and move from philosophy to action.
Okay, so what would that look like? How do you make that translation immediate and, frankly, uncomfortable for the reader?
Let's start with imitation and expectation. Instead of just saying, question what feels natural, you could reframe it as a direct question, like, can you distinguish between consumption driven by a manufactured need versus a necessity you would have anyway without social pressure?
Wow, yeah, that distinction between manufactured need and necessity is key. It immediately forces you to look at your own buying habits in a totally different light.
Absolutely. Or what about professional exhaustion? Striving for that image of success? The author could ask, is your professional exhaustion coming from a strive for dignity, like genuine competence, or from a strive for validation, just maintaining an image for others?
That's fantastic. That question immediately applies the core principle of self-exposure to the daily grind. It shows you exactly where your energy is going, to your work or to a mask.
And one more. We have to use that powerful idea of inherited narratives, that the most effective exploitation is the one people defend themselves.
Yes, that's where the real work is.
So we need an actionable, uncomfortable question there. Something like, name 3 specific values or beliefs you defend fiercely, in politics, ethics, whatever, that you inherited without ever personally examining their foundation or whether they align with justice.
That is deeply uncomfortable. It removes the excuse of ignorance and forces that self-exposure the text demands. It moves the entire conversation from, I understand this intellectually, to, I have to confront this personally.
And that's the difference between a great essay and a real catalyst for change.
So, this material is incredibly strong. The framework is powerful, the critique is brilliant. The feedback we've offered is really just about maximizing that impact.
To quickly recap the 3 big opportunities, first, bolster that central philosophical pivot. Use non-theological logic to make the jump to a conscious existence feel earned, not just asserted.
Second, refine the rhetorical tone. Engage with the strongest counterarguments, especially from secular ethics, to make your own conclusion feel that much more inevitable and resilient.
And finally, translate that insightful analysis of modern exploitation into a concrete diagnostic checklist. Give the reader specific tools to recognize and start dismantling their own chains of imitation and expectation.
These are the points where a little strengthening will just deepen engagement and really drive home the ethical imperative for the reader. We genuinely look forward to seeing where this piece goes.
We invite you to take these suggestions and submit your revised work back to us for a follow-up critique. Until next time.